I stood in the doorway of my husband's office with a small blue box in my hand, and through the half-open blinds I watched him lift my best friend's hand to his lips the same way he used to lift mine. Before I tell you what happened next, and before my hand starts shaking again just from remembering it, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, if you believe people can fall down and still find their way back to who they were meant to be, if you believe in forgiveness and hope and second chances even when the whole world seems to be crumbling in front of you, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community here means more to me than I can say, and stories like this one are easier to tell when I know there are kind hearts on the other side of the screen listening. Now let me take you back to the morning it all began, because to understand how a 15-year marriage nearly shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in June, you have to understand how much light there was in it before the shadows crept in. My name is Margot Whitfield, and for 15 years I was married to a man named Julian, a man I had loved since I was 23 years old and still stubborn enough to believe that love, real love, was supposed to be easy. We met in a bookstore in the town where I grew up, back when bookstores still smelled like cedar shelves and old paper, and he had been reaching for the same battered copy of a novel I wanted, and instead of fighting me for it he simply smiled and said I could have it, and then he bought his own copy just so we would have something to talk about over coffee. That was Julian. Quietly generous. The kind of man who let you win even when he didn't need to, because watching you smile mattered more to him than being right. We married 2 years later in a small chapel with folding chairs and wildflowers because neither of us had much money, and I remember standing at the altar thinking that I had never in my life felt so certain of anything. 15 years is a long time to build a life with someone. We built ours slowly, the way you build a house you intend to live in forever, one board at a time. Julian opened a small accounting firm in town, the kind that did taxes for the diner down the street and the auto shop on the corner and half the retired schoolteachers who lived along Maple Row. I taught second grade at the elementary school 3 blocks from our house, the kind of job where you come home smelling like crayons and glue and small triumphant victories, like the day a struggling reader finally sounds out a whole sentence on his own. We had a daughter, Nora, who was 13 that summer and already taller than me, with her father's steady brown eyes and my stubborn chin. We had a modest brick house with a porch swing that needed oiling and a garden that never quite behaved the way I wanted it to, and on Sunday mornings Julian made pancakes shaped like animals that were supposed to look like elephants but always came out looking more like potatoes with legs, and Nora and I ate them anyway and told him they were the best elephants we had ever seen. Our 15th anniversary was approaching that June, and I had been planning something for months. Not a big, loud kind of surprise, but something quiet and meaningful, the kind of gift that says I see you, I see everything you've given up and everything you've carried, and I am grateful for every single day. Julian had wanted a Rolex since before I even knew him. Not out of vanity, not because he cared about impressing anyone at the country club we didn't belong to, but because his father had worn one, a scratched old date just that ticked on his wrist through every hard year of Julian's childhood, through the layoffs and the debt and the long stretches when there wasn't enough to go around. When his father passed, the watch had gone to Julian's older brother, and Julian never said much about it, but I knew it had hurt him in a place he didn't like to talk about. I had been saving from every paycheck for nearly 2 years, squirreling away small amounts into an account he didn't know existed, skipping the new coat I wanted, skipping the vacation Nora begged for, telling myself it would all be worth it the moment I saw his face. I picked it up from the jeweler on a Tuesday morning, the 14th of June, 3 days before our actual anniversary because I wanted time to have it engraved on the back, for simple words, 15 years, still choosing you. The jeweler, a soft-spoken older man named Mr. Whitcomb who had sold rings and watches in that same shop for almost 40 years, wrapped it in blue velvet and placed it inside a small blue box, and as he handed it to me he said something I have never forgotten. He said that in all his years behind that counter, watching couples buy engagement rings and anniversary gifts, he had learned that the gifts people chose said less about what they could afford and more about what they were willing to remember. I drove home with that box on the passenger seat like it was something alive, something breathing, and I decided on a whim, the kind of whim that changes the entire shape of your life, that I wasn't going to wait 3 days. I was going to surprise him that very afternoon, at his office, during his lunch hour, because I knew Nora had a dentist appointment and would be with my sister until evening, and for once Julian and I would have an entire afternoon to ourselves, something we hadn't had in longer than I wanted to admit. I want you to understand something about the years leading up to that day, because it matters to the rest of this story. Julian and I had not been distant, not in any way I could have pointed to and said, "Here, this is where the crack began." We still held hands in the car. We still argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash and still laughed at the same tired jokes we'd been telling each other for a decade. But there had been a quiet wearing down, the kind that happens to almost every marriage that survives long enough to reach its middle years, and neither of us had noticed it happening because it happened the way water wears down stone, invisible day to day, undeniable over time. His firm had been struggling with a client dispute that kept him at the office late. I had taken on extra hours tutoring after school to help cover Nora's braces. We were two exhausted people who loved each other deeply and simply hadn't had the energy lately to say so out loud, to sit across from each other the way we used to really look at one another instead of past one another on the way to the next task. I didn't know it then, but exhaustion is fertile soil for loneliness, and loneliness, given enough time and the wrong company, can grow into something that frightens even the people who never meant for it to take root. The wrong company, in this case, was my best friend, a woman named Charlotte Delacroix, who had been in my life since we were 17 years old and passing notes in the back row of Mrs. Ferris's history class. Charlotte was the maid of honor at my wedding. She was the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room the night Nora was born, pacing the hallway with Julian because I had banned them both from the delivery room for being too anxious to be helpful. Charlotte had been there for every milestone of my adult life, and I had been there for hers too, through a divorce that left her hollowed out in ways she rarely spoke about, through the loss of her mother, through the slow rebuilding of a life that had once looked so different from the one she ended up living. She worked as a paralegal 2 towns over and often stopped by our house on weekends, sat at our kitchen table drinking wine with me while Julian grilled in the backyard, told stories that made Nora laugh so hard she nearly fell off her chair. I trusted Charlotte with my life. More than that, I trusted her with my husband, in the easy, unthinking way you trust someone you have never once imagined as anything other than family. What I did not know, what I could not have known because neither of them ever gave me a single reason to suspect it, was that over the past several months, in the quiet corners of ordinary days, something had begun to shift between Charlotte and Julian. It did not happen the way it happens in movies, with some single dramatic moment where two people fall into each other's arms. It happened the way most betrayals happen, slowly, deniably, in 100 small moments that felt harmless at the time. Charlotte's divorce had left her raw and frightened of her own judgment, convinced she had lost the ability to tell a good man from a bad one. She had started confiding in Julian during the weeks I was buried in grading papers and running Nora to orthodontist appointments, first about small things, then about the loneliness that kept her up at night, then about a fear she could barely say out loud, that she was fundamentally unlovable, that something in her had driven her own husband away and would drive everyone else away too. And Julian, who had always been the kind of man who couldn't watch someone hurting without trying to fix it, who had spent his whole life being the reliable one, the steady one, the one who showed up, found himself in the strange and dangerous position of being needed by someone in a way that felt, God help him, good. Not good in the way our marriage was good, not good in the deep, rooted way of 15 years and a daughter and a life built board by board. But good in the way a compliment feels good after a long stretch of feeling invisible. Good in the way attention feels when you've quietly stopped expecting it. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I do not believe Julian set out to betray me. I do not believe Charlotte set out to steal something that wasn't hers. I believe two lonely, tired, frightened people made a series of small, quiet choices that each felt insignificant on their own, the way one step off a path doesn't feel like getting lost, until eventually they looked up and found themselves somewhere they never intended to be. That does not excuse what I saw when I walked through that office door. It never will. But it matters, later in this story, and I promise you it matters more than you might expect right now. That Tuesday afternoon, I remember the drive to Julian's office with unusual clarity, the kind of clarity your mind holds onto because it doesn't yet know it's about to be shattered. The sky was the pale, high blue of early summer. I had the windows down and the radio on low, some old song about staying young forever, and the little blue box sat on the passenger seat where Julian usually sat, and I kept glancing at it at red lights like it was a secret I could barely contain. I parked in the small lot behind his office building, a converted Victorian house on Fenwick Street with green shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of building where every accountant and dentist and small-town lawyer in a 50-mile radius seemed to have set up shop at one point or another. His receptionist, a kind older woman named Dolores who had worked for him since he opened the firm, was out at lunch, her desk empty, a half-finished crossword puzzle sitting beside her coffee mug. The hallway was quiet. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how perfectly the day was unfolding, how I could not have asked for a better setting to hand my husband this small box that represented 2 years of quiet saving and 15 years of quiet love. His office door was not quite closed. Through the gap, through the half-lowered blinds that let thin stripes of afternoon light fall across the room, I saw them. Julian was standing near the window with his back partially to the door, and Charlotte was standing close to him, closer than any explanation I could immediately conjure would allow, her hand resting against his chest, and as I stood frozen in that hallway with a Rolex in a blue velvet box clutched in my fist, I watched my husband lift her hand from his chest and press his lips to the back of it, slow and tender, in a gesture I recognized instantly because it was the exact gesture he used to greet me with in the early years of our marriage, before life got busy, before the gesture quietly disappeared from our own routine without either of us noticing it was gone. I did not hear what they were saying to each other. I don't think I could have heard anything over the sound of my own heartbeats suddenly roaring in my ears. I only remember that Charlotte was crying, and Julian's other hand came up to brush a tear from her cheek, and something in his face, something achingly soft and familiar, told me with a certainty deeper than words that I had just witnessed something that had been happening for longer than one single moment. I don't remember deciding to make a sound. I remember the blue box slipping from my hand and hitting the hardwood floor with a small, sharp clatter that seemed impossibly loud in that quiet hallway, and I remember both of their heads snapping toward the door, and I remember the exact moment Julian's face went from tenderness to horror, the color draining out of it so fast he looked almost gray. And I remember Charlotte stepping back from him so quickly she nearly knocked over the small side table by the window. Nobody said anything for what felt like an entire lifetime, though it could only have been a second or two. I looked at the two people I trusted most in the world standing there in the wreckage of a moment I was never supposed to witness, and then I looked down at the little blue box lying open on the floor between us, the watch gleaming up at all three of us in the afternoon light, its engraved message facing upward as if the universe itself wanted to make sure Julian read it before I turned and walked away. 15 years, still choosing you. I did not scream. I want you to know that, because I think people expect screaming in moments like this, and maybe some women do scream, and there would be nothing wrong with that if they did. But I simply stood there for a moment, feeling something enormous and silent crack open inside my chest, and then I bent down, picked the watch box up off the floor with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely close my fingers around it, and I walked out of that office without a single word. Julian called my name behind me, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard before, not even the day his father died, and I heard Charlotte say my name too, softer, more broken, but I did not turn around. I walked past Dolores's empty desk and out the front door and down the porch steps and across the parking lot to my car, and I sat behind the wheel for a long moment simply staring at my hands, at the little blue box still clutched between them, before I finally allowed myself to cry, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it frightens you, the kind that makes your whole body shake with the force of it. I drove home without any memory of the drive itself. I remember arriving in our driveway and sitting there for nearly an hour, watching the shadows of the maple tree shift slowly across the hood of the car as the afternoon wore on, trying to understand how a day that had started with so much hope had collapsed into something I couldn't even find words for. Julian called my phone 11 times that afternoon. I did not answer any of them. Around 4 o'clock, I finally went inside, and I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where Charlotte had laughed with my daughter 100 times, the same table where Julian and I had eaten breakfast together that very morning, and I stared at the blue box until the light coming through the window turned gold, then amber, then finally began to fade toward evening, though I want to be clear that what happened after that point, the confrontation, the conversations, everything that followed, all took place in the daylight hours of the days that came after, because I could not have survived what was coming if I'd had to face it in the dark. Julian came home that evening, though I asked him, through a text message because I could not yet bear to hear his voice, to stay somewhere else that night. He respected that request, staying with his brother, and I lay awake in our bed alone, staring at the ceiling, running the image on a loop I could not turn off, his lips against her hand, her tears on his fingers, the particular tenderness in his face that had once, a very long time ago, belonged only to me. I did not sleep. I do not think I even tried. The next morning, I picked up Nora from my sister's house early, before Julian could see her, and I told her, as gently as I could manage while my own world was breaking apart, that her father and I needed some time to work through a hard problem, and that none of it was her fault, and that I loved her more than anything in this world. She was 13, old enough to sense that something enormous had shifted, and she asked me, with a directness only children seem capable of, whether her father had done something wrong. I did not lie to her, but I also did not tell her everything, because some truths are too heavy to hand to a child all at once. I told her that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love most, and that her father and I loved her exactly the same as we always had, no matter what happened between the two of us. She hugged me for a long time in the kitchen doorway, her face pressed into my shoulder, and I remember thinking that whatever else happened, I owed it to that 13-year-old girl to handle the rest of this with as much grace and honesty as I could manage, even if grace felt, in that moment, like the last thing in the world I had access to. Julian asked to meet me 2 days later, at a small park near the elementary school where I taught, a public place, he said, because he understood I might not want to be alone with him, and because he thought maybe neither of us trusted ourselves to stay calm behind closed doors. We met on a bright Thursday morning, the kind of clear June morning that seems almost cruel in its cheerfulness when your whole life has just come apart at the seams. He looked terrible. I want to tell you that with some satisfaction, some small vindictive pleasure, but honestly it only made me sadder, because underneath the anger and the grief I still loved this man, and seeing him gray-faced and hollow-eyed and clearly having not slept any more than I had did not feel like justice. It just felt like more sorrow stacked on top of sorrow. He did not make excuses. I want to give him that, because it mattered to me then and it matters to me now. He sat down on the bench beside me, not too close, and he told me the truth, or as much of the truth as he understood about himself in that raw, disoriented state. He told me about Charlotte's fear and loneliness, about the conversations that had started small and grown large, about a single kiss, just one, that had happened 2 weeks earlier and had haunted him every single day since, filling him with a shame so total he said he had barely been able to look at himself in the mirror. He told me that what I had walked in on was the two of them trying, badly and clumsily, to end whatever had started between them, that Charlotte had come to his office that day specifically to tell him it needed to stop, that the moment I had seen was, in some terrible twist of timing, both the culmination of something that had already been growing and the beginning of an attempt to end it before it went any further. He did not ask me to believe that this made things better. He only asked me to know the whole truth, because he said I deserved that much, even if I never forgave him for the rest of it. I sat on that park bench for a long time without saying anything, watching a group of children play on the swings in the distance, their laughter drifting across the grass in a way that felt almost obscene against the backdrop of what we were discussing. I asked him the question that had been sitting like a stone in my chest since the moment I saw them. I asked him if he loved her. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, something that I believe was the most honest thing he could have said in that moment. He said he did not know what to call what he felt for Charlotte, only that it was not what he felt for me, that it had never been that it had been something built out of loneliness and flattery and the particular vanity of being needed, and that the moment he saw my face in that doorway, the moment he watched the person he loved most in this world crumble in front of him because of something he had done, he understood with a clarity that made him sick to his stomach that he had been Chasing a shadow of something while the real thing, the whole and true and hard-won thing, had been standing right beside him the entire time, simply tired, simply human, simply in need of the same attention he had gone looking for elsewhere. It was not enough. I want to be honest with you about that too. Words in a park on a Thursday morning are not enough to undo the sight of your husband's lips against another woman's hand, and I told him so. I told him that I needed time, more time than either of us could put a number on, and that I did not know yet whether our marriage could survive what had happened, and that I would not pretend otherwise simply to make either of us feel better in that moment. He nodded, and he did not argue, and he told me he would give me whatever time I needed, that he would move into his brother's spare room for as long as necessary, that he understood he had no right to ask anything of me right now except patience with his own uncertainty about how to fix what he had broken. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and I will not pretend otherwise. I threw myself into the end of the school year, grading papers late into the evening not because I needed to but because it kept my hands and mind occupied. Nora split her time between our house and her father's temporary room at her uncle's place, and I watched my daughter navigate a confusion that no 13-year-old should have to carry, and it broke something in me every single time I saw her trying to be strong for both of her parents at once. My sister Beatrice came over most evenings, sitting with me at that same kitchen table, letting me cry when I needed to cry and rage when I needed to rage, never once telling me what I should feel or what I should decide, only that whatever I chose, she would stand beside me. Charlotte tried to reach me during those weeks, first through phone calls I did not answer, then through a long letter she left in my mailbox, which I did not open for nearly 10 days because I could not bear to see her handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and wedding cards and the note she wrote Nora when she was born, welcoming her into a world Charlotte promised to help protect. When I finally did open it, sitting alone at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Nora was at a friend's house, I found not excuses but something closer to a confession, written in the plain, aching language of someone who understood exactly how much damage she had done and was not asking to be forgiven for it, only asking to be understood, if understanding was even possible. She wrote about the terror that had gripped her since her divorce, the conviction that she was somehow broken beyond repair, unable to be loved the way other people were loved, and how Julian's kindness, meant only as friendship, had become something she clung to in a moment of profound weakness, not because she wanted my husband, she wrote, but because she wanted, desperately and shamefully, to feel for even a moment that she was not as unlovable as she believed herself to be. She wrote that she understood if I never spoke to her again, that she did not deserve my friendship after this, and that the greatest regret of her life was not the mistake itself but the particular cruelty of having made that mistake with the one person in the world who had never once, in over 20 years of friendship, given her any reason to doubt her loyalty. I did not respond to that letter for a long time. I could not. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with losing a friend, a grief that runs alongside the grief of a marriage in crisis but is somehow its own separate wound, and I found myself mourning Charlotte almost as much as I was struggling with Julian, because in some strange way I had lost two people I loved on that single Tuesday afternoon, and I did not yet know how, or whether, I could get either of them back. It was my daughter, in the end, who cracked something open in me that I had not been able to crack open on my own. About 6 weeks after that afternoon in Julian's office, Nora came to me one evening while I was doing dishes, and she asked me, in the quiet, searching way children ask the questions that matter most, whether I still loved her father. I told her that I did, because it was true, uncomfortable and complicated as that truth was. She asked me then why I wasn't trying to fix things if I still loved him, and I started to give her some version of the careful, adult answer about complexity and trust and time, and she interrupted me, which she almost never did, and she said something I don't think I will ever forget for the rest of my life. She said that at school, they had been reading a story about a garden that had been neglected until all the flowers died, and how the gardener in the story had two choices, to give up and plant something new somewhere else, or to do the harder work of turning the soil and pulling the weeds and finding out whether anything could still grow there. She said she didn't know which choice was right for grown-ups, because grown-up things were different from garden things, but she wanted to know whether I thought our family's garden was really dead, or whether I thought maybe, if we were brave enough, something could still grow there. I stood at that sink with soap suds dripping from my hands and cried harder than I had cried since the day I found them, not out of sorrow this time but out of something that felt almost like the beginning of clarity. I realized, standing there, that I had spent 6 weeks so consumed by the wound of what had happened that I had not once allowed myself to ask the deeper question underneath it, which was not simply whether Julian had betrayed me, but whether the man I had married, the whole of him, across 15 years, deserved to be defined entirely by the worst 6 weeks of his life, or whether there was still something worth fighting for underneath the wreckage, something that had gotten buried under exhaustion and loneliness and the small daily neglects that no one ever means but everyone eventually commits. I called Julian the next morning and asked him to meet me again, this time not in a public park but at our own kitchen table, the place where our marriage had actually been built, meal by meal, argument by argument, ordinary Tuesday by ordinary Tuesday. I told him I was not ready to say the marriage was saved, that I did not believe in pretending wounds were healed before they actually were, but that I was willing, if he was willing, to do the slow and unglamorous work of finding out whether something could still grow in the soil of what we had. He wept when I said this steady, quiet man I had watched hold his composure through his own father's funeral, and he told me that he would do anything, absolutely anything, to earn back what he had put at risk, and that he understood it would not happen quickly, and that he did not expect it to, and that he was prepared to spend as long as it took proving with his actions what his words alone could never fully repair. What followed was not a montage of romantic gestures, and I think it's important to tell you that honestly, because so many stories about second chances skip over the unglamorous middle and jump straight to the reconciliation, and in doing so they cheat people of understanding what real repair actually requires. Julian went to counseling, first alone and then with me, and in those sessions, held in a modest office above the pharmacy downtown on quiet weekday afternoons, we did the hard work of naming the things that had gone unspoken in our marriage for years before that Tuesday in June. I admitted things too, in that office, things I had never said out loud before, about how invisible I had sometimes felt in the daily grind of teaching and parenting and keeping a household running, about how I had stopped asking Julian how he was really doing somewhere along the way, assuming I already knew the answer because I was too tired to ask the question and actually listen to whatever came back. Neither of our failures excused the others. The counselor, a calm, plain-spoken woman named Dr. Aldridge, was careful never to let either of us use our own pain as a weapon against the other's accountability. But understanding the soil, as Nora might have put it, mattered enormously to whether anything new could actually grow in it. Julian did not simply say he was sorry. He showed it, day after day, in ways so ordinary they might have seemed unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside, but which meant everything to me because I knew exactly how much effort and intention lived inside each small act. He started coming home earlier, not because I demanded it but because he had realized, on his own, how many evenings he had let slip away in the name of work that could have waited. He began writing me letters, actual letters, left on my pillow or tucked into my lunch bag, not grand declarations but small honest observations, about a memory of us he'd been thinking about something he admired in how I handled a hard day with Nora, about his own ongoing effort to understand why he had made the choices he made and how he intended to be different. He rebuilt the porch swing that had been squeaking for 2 years, something I had asked him to fix a dozen times over the years and which had always slipped down his list of priorities, and I remember standing on that porch one Saturday afternoon watching him sand the old wood in the June sunlight, and thinking that there was something almost unbearably tender about watching a man repair the small broken things in a life he had nearly lost, as if fixing the swing was his way of proving, to himself as much as to me, that he still believed there was a life here worth maintaining. Charlotte, for her part, did not disappear from the story either, though her path back into any kind of relationship with me was slower and more uncertain than Julian's, in part because the wound of losing a best friend cuts in a different, more disorienting way than the wound of a husband's betrayal. About 4 months after everything happened, I agreed to meet her, again in a public place, a coffee shop near the school where we used to meet for lunch when Nora was small enough to still be in the stroller Charlotte had helped me pick out. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down in a way that told me the guilt had not been idle in her either. She did not ask me to forgive her. She said, almost word for word, that she understood forgiveness was not owed to her simply because she wanted it, that she had spent the past several months in her own counseling trying to understand why her fear of being unlovable had led her to risk the one friendship that had never once given her reason to doubt she was loved, and that whatever I decided about our friendship going forward, she needed me to know that the years before that Tuesday had been real, that her love for me and for Nora had never been a performance, and that the deepest regret of her life was having let one moment of weakness threaten to erase 20 years of genuine devotion. I did not rebuild my friendship with Charlotte quickly, and I want to be honest that it has never gone back to being exactly what it was before, because I don't think that kind of complete restoration is realistic or even honest, not after something like this. But over the following year, slowly, carefully, we found our way to something new, something with different boundaries and a hard-won kind of honesty neither of us had ever needed with each other before, because we had never before had anything serious enough between us to require it. She apologized to Julian too, in a conversation I was not present for and never asked the details of, because some conversations belong only to the people who need to have them. What mattered to me was watching, over the months that followed, real and consistent change in both of them, not a single dramatic gesture but 100 small, patient, unglamorous choices to be different, to be better, to be worthy of the trust they had broken. I think often about that day at the jewelry store, about what Mr. Whitcomb told me as he handed me that little blue box, that the gifts people choose say less about what they can afford and more about what they're willing to remember. I did not understand, standing at that counter, how prophetic those words would turn out to be, not just about the watch but about the entire year that followed, because in the end, the story of my marriage's survival was not a story about one grand romantic gesture that fixed everything in an instant. It was a story about two people choosing, again and again, on ordinary daylight mornings and long difficult afternoons, to remember what they had built together and to decide, deliberately and repeatedly, that it was still worth choosing. On our 16th anniversary, one full year after the day everything nearly ended, Julian and I sat together on that repaired porch swing, the wood no longer squeaking, Nora inside doing homework at the kitchen table where so much of our repair had actually happened. I had never given him the Rolex. It had sat in its blue box in the back of my closet for that entire year, a physical reminder of the day everything broke, and I had genuinely not known, through most of those months, whether I would ever give it to him at all, or whether I would eventually sell it, or simply keep it hidden away as a monument to a hope that hadn't survived. But that evening, sitting beside him as the sun began its long, slow summer descent, I went inside and retrieved the box from my closet, and I sat back down beside him and placed it in his hands without a word. He opened it slowly, and when he saw the watch, and then turned it over and read the engraving on the back, 15 years, still choosing you, he began to cry in a way I had only seen him cry once before, at his father's funeral, and I understood in that moment that the tears were not simply about the gift itself but about everything the gift represented. The 2 years I had spent saving for it before I ever knew our marriage would be tested, the terrible Tuesday when it had fallen from my hand onto that office floor, and the full year since then that we had both spent, deliberately and painfully and hopefully, choosing each other back into being, one difficult, ordinary, daylight day at a time. He put the watch on his wrist right there on the porch, and he told me that he intended to wear it every single day for the rest of his life, not as a symbol of the mistake he had made, but as a reminder of the grace he had been given, a grace he promised, with a steadiness in his voice I had not heard from him in a very long time, that he intended to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that broken things are not always beyond repair, that people who fail us are not always beyond redemption, and that forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that requires time and honesty and hard work rather than simply forgetting, can sometimes build something even stronger than what came before, I would love for you to take a moment before this video ends to leave a comment about what this story meant to you, or about a time in your own life when you had to decide whether something broken was still worth mending. Your words matter to our community more than you know, and I read every single one. I think about that gardening story Nora told me at the kitchen sink more often than I could have imagined, back when I was standing there with soapy hands and a broken heart, unsure whether anything could grow again in soil that had been so badly damaged. I know now that some gardens really are beyond saving, and I want to say clearly, for anyone watching this who is standing at their own crossroads, that choosing to walk away from something broken is sometimes the healthiest, bravest, most self-respecting choice a person can make, and there is no shame in it, none at all. But I also know now, because I lived it, that some gardens, tended with enough honesty and enough patience and enough genuine willingness to change on both sides, can come back to life in ways more beautiful than anyone standing over the wreckage could have imagined. Julian still wears that watch every single day, 3 years later now, and every so often I catch him glancing down at it during some ordinary daylight moment, at the breakfast table or on the porch swing or in the car on the way to Nora's soccer games, and I know exactly what he's remembering, because I'm remembering it too. Not the worst afternoon of our marriage, though we never pretend that afternoon didn't happen. But the year that came after it, the long, difficult, daylight year when two imperfect people decided, over and over again, that love is not a feeling you simply have, but a choice you keep making, especially on the days it would be so much easier not to. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Our family here grows a little stronger every time one of these stories reaches someone who needed to hear it, and I am endlessly grateful that you chose to spend this time with me and with Margot's story today. Wherever you are in your own life, whatever garden you might be standing over right now wondering if anything can still grow there, I hope you'll remember that hope, patience, and honest love have a way of surprising us, even on the days we're most afraid to believe in them.